welcome to the video. Today I'm going to talk about a new release by a band that I'd given up on, or all but given up on. And that new release is by a band called Big Big Train, and the album is called The Likes of Us. Now, Big Big Train, you might never have heard of them. If you're interested in progressive rock, and I've had a long history of being interested in that genre, and I made a video about Genesis, my first video on music a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago now. And I've maintained an interest in progressive rock over the years, and always been on the lookout for a band that could match those early 70s rock royalty, progressive rock royalty, like Yes and King Crimson, Genesis, and so on. And I've never found one until about 15 years ago. And someone on Twitter, back in the days when I was on Twitter and before it became the shit show that it is now, somebody turned me on to Big Big Train. Said, you probably like Big Big Train because, back in the late noughties, Twitter was kind of new and people were actually making connections and having conversations rather than screaming at each other. And Big Big Train, and this guy recommended to me an album called The Underfall Yard, which had been just released in 2009. And what is it about Big Big Train? Why did this particular album resonate with me? Well, if you imagine, a long-standing Genesis fan, and my Genesis video kind of makes clear that the pop years weren't my favorite. My favorite period was the early middle period, back in the day when they had Gabriel and probably most importantly Steve Hackett from my point of view. But imagine Big Big Train. They are imagine Genesis albums: Trespass, Nursery Crime, Maybe Foxtrot, Selling England by the Pound, Not the Lamb, Trick of the Tail, and Wind and Wuthering. And imagine what was great about those albums. Just remember what was great. Well, you had great musicianship, you had lots of melody going on, wild dynamic swings, different time signatures, wonderful storytelling. And what Big Big Train have managed to do is to harness all of the qualities of that, and then with the help of their sound engineer, Rob Aubrey, who does a fantastic job, they've created a kind of audiophile quality, modern progressive rock sound. And what they've done, they've retained that English vibe by adding a brass ensemble, and don't think about soul music's brass sections or Southside Johnny and the Asbury Jukes and all that sort of stuff. Imagine colliery brass bands, so a very melancholic, very kind of a subtle sound, and that has enhanced that English vibe within their music. And then you just add on top of that very, very tasteful violin, and you've got something that is quintessentially English in its sound. And so they've, unlike a lot of their contemporaries in the progressive rock scene who draw on all the instrumental prowess and the virtuosity and all that dynamic stuff that I talked about, where there's a tendency, I think, is that they kind of create the musical palette, they create all these great arrangements, and then they think, well, we'll put a vocalist on top and hope that they carry the day. They never quite do. And I think particularly when I think about singers in progressive rock, and I'm going way back now, back into the 70s, and think about Kansas and Styx, and you've got Steve Walsh, and I think, is it Tommy Shaw or Dennis DeYoung who sing for Styx? I can't quite remember. I've not listened to them for a while. These singers were very big on projecting their voice into the audience. And one of the things that Big Big Train managed to do from the Underfall Yard onwards, they recruited a singer who was able to do something quite different. And I've heard it said, when it comes to charisma in business or in movie stars and so on, one of the things that really works, two things that work for the male voice. One, apparently this is scientifically proven, that the deeper the male voice, the more resonant and the more attractive they are perceived to be. So a high-pitched voice is kind of not as attractive as a deep voice. But also when you think about acting and singing, um, what draws people in to the voice is not that great projecting voice, in like I talked about with Walsh and DeYoung or Shaw. It's the ability to sing quietly and soulfully because it draws the listener in. So the vocals are quiet, it kind of piques the curiosity of the listener, and so they get drawn in. And there are a couple of brilliant singers who used to do that fantastically well. And one of them, of course, is Sinatra, Frank Sinatra. We all know My Way is a great example of where he has those wild swings in his singing. He sings quietly and then he sings very loudly at the end, and he really carries the day. And although I've hinted at it there in terms of the early verses of My Way, he used to do whole albums of things that of music that was very introspective, and he sang very quietly, and it just drew the listener into this kind of melancholy loner kind of persona, this style, late night listening, if you like. And this is a stunning album, by the way, September of My Years. All songs about a guy who's in his late middle age, knowing that he's in the September of his years, and come come New Year's Eve, he's going to be popping his clogs. And then in the rock genre that most of us are most interested in, you've got Paul Rodgers, and of course that's Paul here from Free and Bad Company. And if you compare Paul Rodgers to heavy metal singers, Paul Rodgers has all that subtlety and range, and he's able to sing quite quietly as well as loud. Whereas a lot of heavy metal singers, Bruce Dickinson, anyone, just kind of be screaming, and it kind of appeals, but after a while it gets really, really tiresome. Anyway, Big Train recruited this guy called David Langdon. Now, before the Underfall Yard, this band had been around for a number of years, and they'd 5 albums before that. And when I heard the Underfall Yard, I thought something is particularly interesting here, is that there's a richness and a depth to their music that I've not heard from any of their contemporaries, and maybe in all of the years since the 1970s heyday of progressive rock. But then they released, following that album, they released 2 albums with the same title, English Electric and English Electric 2, Part 2. Both of these are double albums, and they managed to pull them together and create what they called Full Power, which had all those tracks from those 2 double albums, plus tracks from an EP that they released soon afterwards. And they pulled it all together in this album. Now, if you're interested in progressive rock music and you're not familiar with this album, let me tell you, I think this is undoubtedly one of the top 10 progressive rock albums of all time. Might even be top 5. And it's safe to say that if this band had been around in the early 1970s, they'd all be living in converted castles and stately homes by now. They would have made an absolute mint. So yeah, really, really fantastic album. So anyway, they continued. Well, actually, they hadn't done live shows for ages, and then they did a couple of live shows on the back of it, and they did the first one in August 2015 at King's Place in London, and I'd been to King's Place a couple of times before because it's a conference venue, but they played on this stage, and there's just maybe holds about 300 people. Not a great rock, not a typical rock venue anyway. But they did 2 or 3 shows over a weekend, and they were absolutely amazing. And it was almost like they'd been rehearsing for months, and then they pulled it all together. And if you watch the clips that are available on YouTube, you see a band that is tight as a drum, fantastic musicianship, and everything is just really, 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 really good if you like that sort of music. And if you imagine that Full Power here, English Electric Full Power, the tracks are, there's, Make Some Noise. The opening track is about 4 minutes long, but the rest of it, they're all like 10, 15, 7, 8, 9, 10 minute, 15-minute songs. And they're, almost all of them are classics. So what they did, they They had some success of those live shows, and then they quickly got together again and released this album called Folklore. And I was lucky to nab an invitation to a playing of this album in the presence of the band, all except the drummer, that is, at what was Peter Gabriel's Real World Studios in Wiltshire. Now, I'd always been a fan of Peter Gabriel, and Real World Studios were kind of established like legendary status. So I was thrilled to go there, and I was able to sit through the full performance of this album and an acoustic performance by the band that followed it. And we got to chat to the band and everything. It was really good, nice people and everything. But anyway, I took this album away, and to be honest with you, it's another double album. I was disappointed. I thought it was like, maybe it's the title Folklore, the title track Folklore, that a bit more of naturally a folky vibe. And I thought, well, it's not quite, doesn't quite work for me. There's not the depth. There doesn't seem to be the dynamism of this of the previous albums. And I thought, well, okay, I'll stick with it. And of course, I ended up seeing them again. In fact, I saw them again at Cadogan Hall in London, just in 2017, a couple of years later. But in the meantime, from those first shows, they released Grimsbound, The Second Brightest Star, and soon after that, they released the Grand Tour. And each one progressively becoming just less exciting, and it was more of the same musical style, same embellishments from the brass ensemble and the violin, the same storytelling thing going on. And I thought, well, just like every band, these bands have a natural life cycle, to the listener. We like a particular period better than others. I thought, well, maybe it's me. But then they released a couple of more albums, but I'd kind of stepped off the train, as it were, by then. And I thought, well, this is a band that's kind of wanting to make a transition to become more successful. I mean, it's worth saying as well, I think all of these musicians in this band, apart from the drummer, they all had day jobs. So they weren't really full-time musicians until about 5 years ago. But they were building up an audience, there's no question about it. And they released a couple of albums, Common Ground and Welcome to the Planet. That didn't really appeal to me that much. The songs were a bit shorter, seemed thrown together a little bit more quickly. But nevertheless, I still saw them a couple more times, and then in 2021, their singer died. David Langdon, this fantastic, soulful singer, died in an accident at his home. And I thought, well, that's the end of the band, because he was so important to the success and the differentiation of this particular band. So I thought they finished. But anyway, wasn't too long before, after the grieving period, which was substantial, I understand, because the main founder of the band and primary songwriter, Gregory Sporton, I think he'd become real bosom buddies with David Langdon, and took his loss very significantly. And I think there was a moment, or quite a period, where they thought the band wasn't going to continue. And it was around this period, as well as that, some of the other members of the band that had come on board, David Gregory, the guitarist who used to be in XTC, keyboardist, co-founder Andy Poole, Danny Manners, another keyboard piano player, Rachel Hall, the violin player, they kind of all left the band. And then we found out online that the band was indeed going to be resurrected, and they were going to bring on a new vocalist. And they'd found this vocalist called Alberto Bravin. And he played in a modern version of Premiata Foneria Marconi, PFM, the famous Italian prog band. And Alberto is Italian. And there were a few interviews online, and little bit of singing examples, snippets that we picked up, and I went to see them again. They toured, and I saw them, I think in October, September, October, maybe August last year in Birmingham again, with a new lineup. Gregory Sporton's still there. Ricard on guitar is still there. Nick DiVigilio on drums is still there. But I think just everybody else apart from the brass ensemble were new people. And Alberto was fronting the band. And I have to say, I was very unimpressed. I thought the band made a big mistake in focusing on trying to perform the material that David Langdon was singing on, the older classic material. And Alberto, with Italian accent, just didn't seem to fit this band. Instead of having this quintessential English sound, it became very international sounding and generic, in my judgment. And there was something about the demeanor of the band on stage, in that the previous band had a kind of a gravitas about them. They had a mood that was studious, serious, but you could tell they were enjoying it. But the new band spent half the concert smiling and laughing at each other while they were playing. They're having such a great time, and yet it didn't seem consistent with the themes within the music and of course the rebuilding of the band after David Langdon's death. So I left that show thinking, I'm done. I'll still listen to the old stuff because it's fantastic, but I'm not going to follow the band any longer. Anyway, long preamble. Forgive me. Friend of mine dropped me a message 3 weeks ago and said, "Have you heard the new Big Big Train album? Don't think it's very good." And I thought, well, my mate Don, he listened to the album. I thought, well, he knows them. He's a fan, so his judgment I trust. But I was curious. I thought, I wonder what it does sound like. I wonder what they've done with Alberto Bravin on vocals. And so I bought the CD, £10 or whatever it is on Amazon. And I sat there and I thought, well, I'm going to give it a proper listen. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to sit between the speakers and I'm going to listen to this album properly. And I thought, okay, well, the melodies are going to take a while to come out because, progressive rock music, very often you have to listen to it several times before the musical motifs begin to emerge and the melodies. And I thought, well, no, there's something better than I expected here. So I went out, I immediately ordered the vinyl version. And for the last 2.5 weeks, I've been listening to this album. I wouldn't say on rotation, as it were, but I've been listening to it quite a bit. And I have to say, I'm well impressed. And as I say, I definitely wasn't going to buy this album, but something about this makes it worthwhile. So what can I say about it? A couple of things in particular, just thematically. It retains the Big Big Train sound. So it still has violin and brass, providing those embellishments to all the standard stuff on keyboards and lead guitar and all that sort of stuff. And tuneful bass, kind of not quite a Chris Squire bass, but Greg Sporton does play a Rickenbacker. So it retains that sound. You can tell that this album has been well crafted. They could have been forgiven in the aftermath of David Langdon's death to throw an album together quickly and kind of reclaim their place in progressive rock, kind of in the charts, in the hierarchy, as it were. But they haven't done that. They have put together this album with great care. You can absolutely tell there's 1,001 different decisions that they've obviously made in the construction of this album, and it comes together with a richness and a depth that you can hear. The other thing I would say is that, coming back to the vocalist, Bravin has an Italian accent, but Gregory Sporton has worked with him to ensure that his pronunciation is as close as possible to sounding English as it can be. So whereas on stage that Italian twang is very prominent and makes the band sound rootless, as it were, not as English as it was before, but with the care in the studio and on that pronunciation, it still sounds like an English band with a singer that you can't quite place where he's from. And that works really, really well. So this is an album, not of a kind of a revolution, moving on from the old band. This is an evolution. And if they continue on this path, and I've heard Sporten talk about returning to storytelling, because a lot of the themes in this are about camaraderie and loss and carpe diem, obviously in the aftermath of David's death. If they continue and then return to storytelling, they'll be the big train band that we many know and love. What are the highlights on this one? Well, it opens with Light Left in the Day, which is kind of a nice soft piece before it goes into a mostly instrumental track called Oblivion. And then it's got a track, the big track on this album is called Beneath the Masts. And it's written by Gregory Sporten, and it's kind of been inspired by his childhood, living on the outskirts of a town, playing in the fields between two big radio masts. Now, I know this area because Gregory Sporten was brought up in the town that I now live in, and I cycle between these masts all of the time, so I know exactly what he's talking about. But I'm an adult, and as a youngster, he must have been exploring those fields in a way that, I just cycle past them these days. So it's definitely it has that nostalgia vibe. It's a lovely track. It has a lovely emotional coda. The only misstep is that someone came up with the dumb idea of putting a prog metal shredding electric guitar solo in the middle of it. And, guys, they won't watch this video, but if they did, guys, I think that's such a bad idea. It makes you sound like just every other prog or prog metal band that's out there. Because Big Train are known for their solos being very, very tuneful and very controlled. No shredding allowed, as it were. But hey ho, the track is still great though. Nice to do an edit and get rid of that guitar solo. Miramare is really nice. That's again quite a lengthy track. And there's a single, if you can call it a single, called Love is the Light, which on first hearing you think is rather slight, but actually it's rather lovely. And it's got a lovely second half where instrumental section. And the singing on that and on elsewhere on the album is really good. They've got this. There's several people in the band can sing really well, so they deliberately set out in one or two places to create that Beach Boys Pet Sounds vibe where you've got all those harmony vocals going. It works really, really well. And as I say, Alberto Bravin does an absolutely fantastic job on this album. So I was a doubter, but I am very impressed, and I can absolutely recommend this to people who like progressive rock and like Big Train. Give it some time, and it's a good solid 4 stars out of 5. It's not as good as English Electric or the Underfall Yard, but it is a creditable album, and they deserve, as I say, a lot of credit for putting it together and keeping on. So good luck to them in the future. Might see them on a tour this year, might not, but I'll definitely be playing this album throughout the year. It's probably going to be one of my top albums of the year. So yeah, that's Big Train and the Likes of Us. I know this has been a long video. Thanks for sticking with me. I really should have done a shorter version, but there you go. Once I start talking, it's pretty hard to know what to leave out. But hey ho, thanks again. I'll see you on the next video. Bye for now.